Every time you repeat a behavior, you're literally sculpting your brain. Not metaphorically, literally. Neurons that fire together wire together, creating physical pathways that determine who you become. The person you are right now is the accumulated result of millions of micro-habits you've practiced, most without conscious awareness. For centuries, philosophers debated whether human nature was fixed or malleable. Today, neuroscience has settled this ancient question definitively. Your brain is the most adaptable organ in your body, constantly reorganizing itself based on your experiences, thoughts, and behaviors. This phenomenon, called neuroplasticity, represents perhaps the most hopeful discovery in human history, the recognition that who you are is not who you must remain. The philosophical implications are staggering. If your brain physically changes in response to your mental activities, then consciousness isn't just emerging from brain structure, it's actively shaping that structure. Every thought you think, every action you take, every habit you practice is literally sculpting your neural architecture and thereby determining your future capabilities and limitations. This creates what I call the plasticity paradox. Your current brain structure, shaped by past habits, determines your present behavioral tendencies, but your present choices simultaneously reshape that structure, influencing your future self. You are both the sculptor and the sculpture, constantly creating the neural foundation from which tomorrow's decisions will emerge. Neuroscientist Norman Doidge documents cases that challenge everything we thought we knew about brain limitations. Stroke patients who lost the ability to speak gradually rewired alternative neural pathways to recover language. People born with half a brain developed normal cognitive abilities as remaining neurons adapted to perform multiple functions. Elderly individuals learned entirely new skills, growing new neural connections well into their 80s and 90s. But here's what makes this relevant to everyday life. The same neuroplastic principles that enable recovery from brain injury also govern ordinary habit formation. Every time you practice a behavior, checking your phone, feeling grateful, procrastinating, exercising, you strengthen specific neural pathways while others atrophy. Your brain is constantly being rewired. The question is whether this rewiring aligns with your conscious intentions. The ancient Greeks had a concept called hexis, the idea that virtue is developed through repeated practice until it becomes second nature. Aristotle understood intuitively what modern neuroscience has proven empirically. We become what we repeatedly do, not just behaviorally but literally at the level of brain structure and function. This means that personal transformation isn't about willpower or motivation. It's about systematically engineering neuroplastic change through carefully designed behavioral interventions. Small, consistent actions create large-scale neural reorganization over time, fundamentally altering your cognitive capabilities, emotional patterns, and behavioral tendencies. Understanding how tiny habits rewire your brain requires examining the neural circuits that govern automatic behavior. The primary hub is the basal ganglia, an ancient brain structure that converts conscious actions into unconscious routines through a process neuroscientists call behavioral chunking. When you first learn a new skill, driving a car, typing, playing an instrument, your prefrontal cortex works intensively to coordinate complex sequences of actions. Brain imaging shows heightened activity as you consciously direct each movement. But as you practice, something remarkable happens. Activity shifts from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia, and the complex sequence becomes stored as a single chunk that can be executed automatically. This neural efficiency mechanism evolved to free up conscious attention for novel challenges while handling routine activities on autopilot. But it also means that repeated behaviors literally carve grooves in your brain, creating what neuroscientist Anne Graybiel calls neural superhighways that become increasingly easy to access and difficult to avoid. The habit loop itself involves three distinct neural components: the cue detection system, mediated by the sensory cortex and hippocampus; the routine execution system, controlled by the basal ganglia; and the reward evaluation system, involving dopamine pathways in the ventral tegmental area. Understanding each component is crucial for habit modification. Cue detection operates below conscious awareness, scanning your environment for triggers associated with habitual behaviors. Your brain learns to associate specific contexts, times, emotions, or social situations with particular routines. Once a cue is detected, the basal ganglia automatically initiates the associated behavior sequence without consulting your conscious decision-making systems. The dopamine reward system provides the neurochemical fuel that drives habit formation. Contrary to popular belief, dopamine doesn't signal pleasure. It signals prediction error, the difference between expected and actual outcomes. This system learns to anticipate rewards associated with habitual behaviors, creating craving states that drive repetition even when the behavior no longer provides satisfaction. Here's the crucial insight: your brain doesn't distinguish between good and bad habits at the neurological level. It simply strengthens whatever neural pathways you activate most frequently. This is why breaking unwanted habits requires more than willpower. It requires systematically rewiring the underlying neural circuits through strategic behavior modification. Research by neuroscientist Kyle Smith reveals that habit strength correlates directly with the physical structure of neural pathways. Repeated behaviors cause neurons to develop thicker myelin sheaths, the insulating material that increases signal transmission speed. Habitual behaviors literally become hardwired through these structural brain changes, which explains why established habits feel so automatic and effortless. The most counterintuitive aspect of neuroplastic change is that smaller interventions often create larger transformations than dramatic efforts. This occurs because of what I call the minimum effective dose principle, the smallest action that triggers meaningful neural adaptation without overwhelming your brain's capacity for change. Neuroscientist Michael Merzenek's research on brain training reveals that neuroplastic change follows specific parameters. The brain adapts most effectively to challenges that are novel enough to require attention but not so difficult as to trigger stress responses that inhibit learning. This creates what researchers call the zone of proximal development, the sweet spot where growth occurs naturally. When you attempt massive behavioral changes, you often exceed this zone, activating defensive neural circuits that resist modification. Your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, interprets radical change as potential threat, triggering stress responses that impair neuroplasticity and strengthen existing habit patterns as a survival mechanism. Tiny habits sidestep this resistance by operating below the threshold of threat detection. A 2-minute meditation practice doesn't trigger the same psychological resistance as committing to hour-long sessions. Reading 1 page per day feels manageable in ways that planning to read for hours doesn't. These small actions slip past your brain's change resistance mechanisms while still providing sufficient stimulus for neural adaptation. Stanford researcher B.J. Fogg has documented how behavior design can leverage these neuroplastic principles systematically. His research shows that sustainable behavior change requires 3 elements: sufficient motivation, adequate ability, and effective triggers. Tiny habits optimize all three factors by making the behavior so small that motivation and ability requirements are minimal while creating clear environmental triggers. But here's the deeper principle. Tiny habits work because they focus on identity change rather than outcome achievement. When you do 2 push-ups every morning, you're not just strengthening your muscles, you're strengthening your neural representation of yourself as someone who exercises. This identity shift, mediated by changes in the default mode network of your brain, gradually aligns your other behaviors with this evolving self-concept. Consider the story of David Kim, a software developer who wanted to become more creative but felt trapped in analytical thinking patterns. Instead of trying to overhaul his entire approach to problem solving, David implemented a single tiny habit, spending 3 minutes each morning sketching random objects on his desk. This seemingly trivial practice began rewiring David's visual processing networks and strengthening connections between his logical left hemisphere and creative right hemisphere. Within months, colleagues noticed his innovative approaches to coding challenges. The tiny sketching habit had catalyzed broader neural changes that enhanced creative thinking across multiple domains of his life. The key insight is that your brain doesn't compartmentalize habit changes. Neural modifications in one area create ripple effects throughout your entire cognitive and emotional system. A tiny habit that strengthens focus will improve your performance in completely unrelated areas. A small practice that reduces stress will enhance your creativity, decision-making, and interpersonal relationships. Individual tiny habits create what systems theorists call cascade effects, small changes that propagate through complex networks, creating large-scale transformations that seem disproportionate to their initial triggers. In the context of brain change, a single habit modification can ultimately restructure your entire neural landscape. This occurs because your brain is not a collection of independent modules but an integrated network where changes in one region automatically influence others. Neuroscientist Olaf Sporns describes this as the connectome, the complete map of neural connections that creates your unique cognitive and emotional fingerprint. When you modify one connection through habit practice, you indirectly affect thousands of others. The anterior cingulate cortex, which plays a crucial role in attention regulation and conflict monitoring, demonstrates this principle perfectly. When you strengthen this region through practices like meditation or focused breathing, you simultaneously improve your capacity for emotional regulation, decision-making, and impulse control. These improvements then make it easier to establish additional positive habits, creating an upward spiral of neural development. Research by neuroscientist Richard Davidson shows that just 8 weeks of mindfulness practice creates measurable changes in brain structure and function. The hippocampus, crucial for learning and memory, increases in gray matter density. The amygdala, responsible for stress and anxiety responses, shows reduced reactivity. The prefrontal cortex, governing executive function, develops stronger connectivity with emotional centers. But these changes don't remain isolated to meditation practice. Participants report improvements in sleep quality, creativity, interpersonal relationships, and work performance. A single habit practice had rewired their brains in ways that enhanced multiple life domains simultaneously. This cascade effect explains why tiny habits often succeed where dramatic change attempts fail. When you focus on one small, sustainable practice, you're not just building that specific habit, you're strengthening the neural infrastructure that supports all habit formation. Your brain becomes better at creating new patterns while simultaneously making existing positive patterns more automatic. The philosopher William James observed that, all our life, so far as it has definite form, is but a mass of habits. Modern neuroscience reveals the literal truth of this statement. Your personality, capabilities, and behavioral tendencies are the accumulated result of neural pathways strengthened through repetitive practice. Change your habits systematically, and you literally change who you are. Consider the transformation of Lisa Rodriguez, an emergency room physician struggling with chronic anxiety and decision fatigue. The intense demands of her work had created stress response patterns that were affecting her performance and personal relationships. Instead of pursuing dramatic lifestyle changes, Lisa implemented a single tiny habit: taking 3 conscious breaths before entering each patient room. This simple practice began rewiring Lisa's autonomic nervous system, activating parasympathetic responses that countered chronic stress activation. Over time, the breathing habit generalized to other high-pressure situations. Her colleagues noticed improved decision-making under pressure. Her family observed greater emotional availability. Sleep quality improved, creativity increased, and job satisfaction returned. The 3-breath habit had initiated a cascade of neural changes that transformed Lisa's entire life experience. She hadn't just learned a breathing technique, she had rewired her brain's stress response system, which affected every aspect of her functioning. The deepest level of habit-based brain change involves what psychologists call identity reconstruction, the gradual modification of your core self-concept through behavioral evidence accumulation. Every time you practice a tiny habit, you're not just changing your behavior, you're changing your story about who you are, which in turn influences every future decision and action. This process operates through what neuroscientist Antonio Damasio calls the autobiographical self, your brain's ongoing narrative about your identity, capabilities, and place in the world. This narrative isn't just abstract thought, it's encoded in neural networks that influence perception, memory formation, and behavioral choices. When you consistently act in ways that contradict your current self-narrative, your brain gradually updates this story to maintain cognitive coherence. The default mode network, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, plays a crucial role in this identity maintenance system. This network is most active during rest and introspection, constantly constructing and updating your sense of self based on accumulated experiences and behavioral patterns. Tiny habits hack this system by providing consistent behavioral evidence for desired identity changes. When you write 1 sentence daily, you accumulate evidence for being a writer. When you do 5 push-ups each morning, you build evidence for being athletic. Your brain interprets these repeated actions as identity-relevant information and gradually shifts your self-concept accordingly. This identity shift then influences your unconscious decision-making processes. Research by psychologist Sonia Lubomirsky shows that people make thousands of micro-decisions daily based on their self-concept rather than conscious deliberation. When your identity includes someone who exercises regularly, you automatically choose stairs over elevators, park farther away, and feel restless during sedentary periods. The tiny habit has restructured your unconscious decision-making algorithms. The process works because your brain prioritizes consistency between beliefs and behaviors. Cognitive dissonance theory, developed by psychologist Leon Festinger, reveals that mismatches between self-concept and actions create psychological tension that your brain resolves by changing either the belief or the behavior. Tiny habits make the behavioral change so easy that your brain typically resolves the dissonance by updating your identity rather than abandoning the practice. But here's what makes this transformation profound. Identity change doesn't just affect related behaviors, it influences your entire worldview. When you see yourself as someone who follows through on commitments, you become more trustworthy in relationships. When you identify as someone who invests in personal growth, you seek out learning opportunities and challenges. A tiny habit that reconstructs one aspect of identity often catalyzes comprehensive life transformation. The story of Marcus Thompson illustrates this beautifully. As a middle-aged accountant, Marcus felt trapped in routines that no longer served his evolving values. He wanted to become more creative and adventurous but felt constrained by decades of cautious decision-making patterns. Instead of dramatic life changes, Marcus implemented one tiny habit, taking a different route to work each day. This simple practice began rewiring Marcus's openness to novelty and tolerance for uncertainty. His brain started categorizing him as someone who seeks new experiences, which influenced countless other decisions. He began trying new restaurants, attending cultural events, and eventually pursuing photography as a serious hobby. The tiny navigation habit had initiated a cascade of identity changes that transformed Marcus from risk-averse to adventurous. Understanding why tiny habits succeed requires examining the neurochemical systems that motivate behavioral repetition. Your brain contains sophisticated reward circuits that evolved to reinforce survival-relevant behaviors, but these same systems can be strategically engaged to support positive habit formation. Dopamine, often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical, actually functions as a prediction and motivation signal. It's released not when you experience reward, but when you anticipate reward, and especially when actual rewards exceed expectations. This creates what neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky calls dopaminergic uncertainty, the brain state most conducive to habit formation. Tiny habits optimize dopamine release by making success virtually guaranteed while still requiring minimal effort. When you complete a 2-minute reading session, your brain experiences positive prediction error. The task was easy enough to complete but meaningful enough to feel accomplished. This triggers dopamine release that reinforces the neural pathways associated with reading behavior. Over time, this dopamine conditioning creates what researchers call intrinsic motivation. You begin wanting to read not for external rewards but because the reading itself has become neurochemically rewarding. The behavior shifts from something you should do to something you want to do, dramatically increasing long-term sustainability. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter associated with mood regulation and social status, also plays a crucial role in habit sustainability. Research by neuroscientist Barry Jacobs shows that serotonin levels increase when you perceive yourself as making progress toward meaningful goals. Tiny habits provide frequent opportunities for progress recognition, maintaining steady serotonin elevation that supports mood stability and continued motivation. The key insight is that your brain treats small accomplishments as genuine achievements when they align with your values and identity goals. Completing tiny habits generates the same neurochemical rewards as major accomplishments, but with much lower effort requirements and failure risk. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, adds another layer of neurochemical support for habit formation. When tiny habits connect you with others, even indirectly, oxytocin release strengthens the associated neural pathways. This is why sharing your tiny habits with supportive friends or family members dramatically increases success rates. The stress hormone cortisol represents the primary neurochemical obstacle to sustainable habit formation. Elevated cortisol impairs neuroplasticity, weakens memory consolidation, and triggers defensive behaviors that resist change. Tiny habits avoid cortisol elevation by staying well below your stress threshold, allowing your brain to adapt in a relaxed, optimal learning state. Consider the neuroscience behind why most New Year's resolutions fail. They typically involve dramatic behavioral changes that trigger stress responses, depleting dopamine through excessive effort requirements while elevating cortisol through perceived difficulty and failure risk. Your neurochemical systems are working against success rather than supporting it. Tiny habits reverse this dynamic by creating neurochemical conditions optimal for sustainable change: dopamine release through achievable progress, serotonin elevation through consistent success, oxytocin support through social connection, and minimal cortisol elevation through low-stress implementation. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of brain rewiring through tiny habits is the compound effect. How small, consistent investments in neural pathway development create exponential returns over time. Just as financial compound interest generates wealth through repeated small investments, neural compound interest generates capability through repeated small practices. This occurs because of what neuroscientists call synaptic strengthening, the physical process by which repeated neural activity increases the efficiency and reliability of brain connections. Each time you practice a tiny habit, you're making microscopic investments in specific neural pathways. Initially, these investments seem insignificant, but their cumulative effect can be life-changing. The myelin sheath, the fatty tissue that insulates neural pathways, provides a perfect example of this compound effect. Each habit repetition triggers oligodendrocytes to add another layer of myelin around the associated neural circuits. More myelin means faster signal transmission, which makes the behavior feel more effortless and automatic. Over time, heavily myelinated pathways become neural superhighways that your brain preferentially uses for relevant decisions and actions. Daniel Coyle, in his research on talent development, describes this as the deep practice effect. Whether learning piano, developing athletic skills, or building leadership capabilities, sustained improvement comes from repeatedly activating specific neural circuits until they become optimally myelinated and therefore effortlessly accessible. The compound effect also operates at the level of neural network integration. Initially, a new habit might involve only a few brain regions working in isolation. But as the habit becomes established, these regions begin coordinating more efficiently with other brain systems. What started as a localized change becomes integrated into your broader cognitive and emotional architecture. Research by neuroscientist Arne May demonstrates this progression beautifully. When people learn to juggle, initial brain scans show increased activity in visual and motor areas. But after months of practice, the changes spread throughout the brain. Areas responsible for attention, timing, spatial processing, and even emotional regulation show structural modifications. Learning to juggle had triggered comprehensive neural development far beyond the specific skill itself. This principle applies to any tiny habit that engages multiple brain systems. A simple gratitude practice strengthens neural pathways involved in memory recall, emotional regulation, social cognition, and positive future projection. The compound returns extend far beyond the gratitude practice itself, enhancing overall life satisfaction, relationship quality, and resilience to stress. The story of Jennifer Walsh exemplifies this compound effect. As a busy marketing executive, Jennifer felt constantly overwhelmed by competing priorities and never-ending task lists. Instead of trying to overhaul her entire productivity system, she implemented one tiny habit: writing down 3 priorities each morning before checking email. This simple practice began strengthening Jennifer's prefrontal cortex pathways responsible for executive function and goal-directed behavior. Over months, colleagues noticed her improved focus and decision-making. Projects were completed more efficiently. Stress levels decreased significantly. The 3 priorities habit had compounded into comprehensive cognitive enhancement that affected every aspect of her professional and personal performance. But the most profound compound effect occurs when multiple tiny habits begin reinforcing each other, creating what systems theorists call positive feedback loops. Each habit makes the next easier to maintain, while the combined effect exceeds the sum of individual habits. Understanding how tiny habits rewire your brain naturally leads to the question: how do you systematically design the neural architecture you want to inhabit? This requires thinking like a neuroscientist and an architect simultaneously, understanding both the principles of brain change and the strategic design of behavioral interventions. The first principle is neural coherence, ensuring that your tiny habits align with and reinforce each other rather than competing for limited cognitive resources. Your brain has finite capacity for managing new behaviors, so the habits you choose should ideally strengthen overlapping neural systems. For example, combining a tiny meditation habit with a brief gratitude practice leverages shared neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. Both practices strengthen attention regulation and emotional awareness, creating synergistic effects that compound more rapidly than isolated habits. The second principle involves contextual anchoring, strategically linking new habits to existing routines that are already deeply embedded in your neural architecture. This leverages what neuroscientists call habit stacking, where established neural pathways serve as triggers for new behaviors. The key is choosing anchor habits that occur at optimal times for brain change. Morning routines often work best because cortisol and dopamine levels naturally peak after waking, creating ideal neurochemical conditions for new learning. Evening routines can be effective for habits that benefit from memory consolidation during sleep. The third principle is progressive complexity, starting with versions of desired habits that are almost impossibly easy, then gradually increasing complexity as the neural pathways strengthen. This respects your brain's adaptation timeline while preventing the overwhelm that derails most behavior change attempts. If you want to develop a writing habit, start with 1 sentence per day rather than committing to pages. If you want to become more physically active, begin with 1 push-up rather than planning hour-long workouts. Your brain needs time to build the neural infrastructure that supports more complex versions of the desired behavior. The fourth principle involves identity integration, choosing tiny habits that reinforce the same desired identity change from multiple angles. If you want to become someone who prioritizes health, you might combine tiny habits around movement, nutrition, sleep, and stress management. Each habit provides evidence for the same identity shift, accelerating the neural reconstruction process. Consider the transformation of Robert Chen, a software engineer who felt trapped by perfectionist tendencies that paralyzed his creativity and decision-making. Instead of trying to overcome perfectionism directly, Robert designed a set of tiny habits that systematically rewired his relationship with uncertainty and mistakes. He began writing 1 deliberately imperfect sentence each morning, embracing grammatical errors and unclear thinking. He started making 1 small decision without researching all options. He practiced sharing 1 unfinished idea each week with trusted colleagues. These tiny habits gradually rewired Robert's neural response to imperfection, transforming paralyzing perfectionism into productive iteration. Within a year, Robert had launched 2 successful side projects, received a promotion at work, and reported significantly reduced anxiety around performance and judgment. The collection of tiny habits had systematically reconstructed his neural relationship with risk, failure, and growth. The most sophisticated approach involves what I call neural ecosystem design, creating an integrated collection of tiny habits that supports comprehensive brain development across cognitive, emotional, and behavioral domains. This might include practices that strengthen attention, enhance emotional regulation, improve physical health, deepen social connections, and expand creative capabilities. The key insight is that you're not just building individual habits, you're literally architecting the brain you want to live inside. Every tiny habit is a vote for the kind of person you want to become, and your brain keeps a meticulous tally of these votes, gradually reshaping itself to match the pattern of your repeated choices. The science of neuroplasticity reveals perhaps the most empowering truth about human nature. You are not fixed. Your brain, your personality, your capabilities, all of these can be systematically improved through tiny, consistent actions that accumulate into profound transformation over time. Every habit you practice is literally sculpting your neural architecture, determining not just what you do tomorrow, but who you become over the course of your lifetime. This isn't metaphorical, it's measurable, documented neuroscience that puts the power of personal transformation directly in your hands. The key insight is that massive change doesn't require massive effort. It requires consistent, tiny investments in the neural pathways you want to strengthen. 2 minutes of daily practice can rewire your brain more effectively than sporadic hours of intensive effort, because your brain adapts to consistency rather than intensity. Start with one tiny habit. Make it so small that it feels almost ridiculous not to do it. Focus on showing up rather than performing perfectly. Trust that your brain's plasticity will compound these small investments into significant capability over time. Remember that every repetition is literally rewiring your neural architecture in ways that make tomorrow's version of yourself more capable than today's. The person you'll be in 5 years is being determined by the tiny habits you practice starting today. Your future self is not some distant possibility. It's the inevitable result of accumulated neural changes you're creating through your current behavioral choices. This is both sobering and inspiring. Every moment offers the opportunity to vote for the brain you want to inhabit, the capabilities you want to develop, the person you want to become. The votes you cast through tiny, repeated actions will be tallied in physical changes to your neural architecture that determine your future possibilities. Your brain is waiting for your instructions. It will faithfully rewire itself based on whatever patterns you repeatedly provide. The only question is whether you'll architect this process consciously or let it happen by default. If this exploration of neuroplasticity and habit formation resonated with you, subscribe for more insights into practical neuroscience and human potential. Understanding how your brain actually changes isn't just fascinating, it's the foundation for taking conscious control of your own development and transformation. What tiny habit will you start today to begin rewiring your brain for the future you want to create?